And welcome to the latest episode of the Dribble Drive podcast. My name is Austin Render. Excited to have you along for episode 26 of the Dribble Drive. It's a week 3 recap. It's a week 4 preview. A little bit more of a bare bones show just off the top. Let you know, if you're watching in video form, I'm sacrificing the light on my face for a better background. It's beautiful out there. We're here in the Bahamas. Was here with the women's team this week and stay with the men's team the rest of the days here at the Battle for Atlantis. But just a wonderful view. I felt like that was better to have less light on my face than having a curtain behind me. If you're listening on the podcast form, it doesn't matter to you. But for those watching us either live or in a recorded form, I thought it was fun to have a nice little background there. It will be a little bit of a bare bones show today. No guests because I wasn't sure how the resort Wi-Fi would hold up as we're trying to do this show and bring guests in and that kind of stuff. And it's also a holiday week, so we want to let people kind of have their time with their families. A lot of people are on the road right now with their respective teams. So it'll just be me today. We're going to do some recap. I'm going to use today as kind of a reset episode. Where are teams at 3 weeks into the season? Some teams we haven't talked about, like Minnesota, undefeated. Michigan State, undefeated. When are the tests going to start to come on their schedules? Some of those teams, some interesting losses this week. First losses for Nebraska, for Oregon. We'll talk about those as well. Some tight games against good teams. Obviously, the showdowns in Los Angeles is where we're going to start here in a minute, but some awesome games there in LA. And again, another reason will be a little bit bare bones is because I've been tied up. We've had 3 games the last 3 days with Indiana women's basketball. Didn't get to watch those games in LA. Looking forward to when I get home, kind of going back and watching those. But it's been a very busy week. So up front, we're just going to kind of reset the Big Ten landscape. Where is everybody at? What happened this past weekend? What's going to happen here in Feast Week? Going to be kind of an informative episode for you to just kind of take a step back and be like, where are we in this Big Ten season? There's still quite a few undefeated teams in conference play. So let's get into that. But of course, we are a part of the Back Home Network, which is brought to you by Home Field Apparel. Thanks for joining us. If you're on the YouTube channel, the Back Home Network YouTube page, where you can find all of our episodes in video form every Tuesday live at noon. We will drop an episode like we are today. Hop in the chat. If you're watching us online, ask us some questions. We'll try and answer those to the best of our ability. If you're listening to us afterwards in video form, we appreciate you stopping by. We're also available in podcast form on Apple and Spotify podcasts. We're also on social media at Dribble Drive WBB. Go follow us there. Stay up to date on everything that's going on in the Big Ten Conference. As we start our show here, a reminder to catch us every Tuesday at noon here. We will continue to bring in guests as the season goes on, as we mentioned today. Not one of those days, but it does appear that the Wi-Fi is holding up fine. Let me know in the chat if that's not the case. But let's talk game of the week here. Game of the week, no doubt about it. Actually, let's start with the new AP poll that actually dropped yesterday during our game here in the Bahamas when we were when I was broadcasting IU in North Carolina. The new AP poll dropped. New number 1 team, and I realized that is a typo. We're going to change that before we let that sit on the screen any longer. UCLA is the number 1 team in the country right now after their huge win over South Carolina, 77-62. USC fell to top 10 Notre Dame, so they dropped to number 6 in the rankings. Maryland and Ohio State each bump up 1 spot. Number 19, Illinois. They're inside the top 20 and undefeated on the season. Number 21, Oregon, but they did lose last night. We'll talk about that. They were out in Hawaii, fell to Georgia Tech. So we'll see next Monday where the Ducks end up going. Number 22, Iowa has moved into the top 25 for the first time this season. And number 25, Nebraska hangs in there despite their first loss of the year to Creighton. You can see Michigan State. They're the first 2 out. First 2 receiving votes. They're not too far away from getting into that top 25. Indiana's in there. They did just lose yesterday. Pretty dominant win for North Carolina, the Battle for Lance Championship, which we will talk about here momentarily. And Minnesota also receiving a vote in the top 25. They're undefeated so far this season. All right, so let's actually, before we talk about the game of the week, let's talk team of the week. That's the new number 1 team in the country, resides in Los Angeles. The UCLA Bruins are undefeated and have maybe the best win in college basketball right now, snapping the 43-game win streak of the South Carolina Gamecocks with a 77-62 authoritative win over UCLA. It wasn't even, or over South Carolina, it wasn't even a conversation. They kind of dominated this game. London Jones came off the bench, offered 15. Alina Arnisalo had 13 points. Lauren Betts, how about this stat line? Double-double for Lauren Betts. 11 points, 14 rebounds, 4 assists, 4 blocks. Good to see Kiki Rice continuing to get in the fold. She's played in the past couple of games for UCLA after missing some time. She had 11 points. Big one for UCLA, they hit threes. They shot 10 of 21, 48% from three. And South Carolina, despite the Gamecocks going 8 of 12 from three, shot just 36% in total. Great defense by UCLA, holding the Gamecocks down and again snapping the 43-game win streak for the number 1 ranked team and the defending national champions. They fall on the road in LA. So now UCLA is your new number 1 team in the country. They are in the Rainbow Wahine Showdown this week. They're going to take on UT Martin Fresno State in Hawaii out on the islands. So UCLA will travel, get some tests, but still, I think they've proven themselves with wins over Louisville and South Carolina to have earned that number 1 spot. The other matchup that we should talk about is the other one in LA, and that is the win for Notre Dame. They went on the road and beat USC 74-61. Juju Watkins had 24, 6 rebounds, 5 assists, but was just 10 of 25 from the floor. Notre Dame made her life difficult. Kiki Iriafen, 15 points, 9 rebounds, but again, just 5 of 15 from the floor. Couple of glaring issues for USC. Their lack of the three-point shot continues. Just 1 of 13 from 3 in this game. And they have had serious turnover issues this year. How about 21 turnovers in this game for USC, leading to this 13-point loss? They are also in a holiday tournament this week. They are in the Acrisure Holiday Invitational in California, taking on Seton Hall and St. Louis on Wednesday and Friday. So again, they've been tested. They've had a nice win over Ole Miss, tough loss to Notre Dame, but I think USC is going to be just fine. But those turnover issues and the lack of three-point shooting is certainly something to keep an eye on as we go through this season. Another interesting game that earned my game of the week last night here in the Bahamas, down the road to the Baha Mar Pink Flamingo Championship. It was number 7 LSU eking past Washington 68-67. Washington had a late lead. LSU scored with just a couple of seconds left on maybe a questionable call on an over and back that wasn't called on LSU. They turned it into the game-winning bucket to win by 1. Washington has had an up and down start to the season. There's no doubt about that. They lost to Montana, but this was a really nice performance by Washington. Savia Sellers was really good. 24 points, 4 of 8 from 3. Ella Dean continues to put up good numbers. She was in double figures to go with 9 rebounds. But they were right there on the precipice of turning something around this season. It's been, like I said, they lost to Montana. Earlier last week on Thursday, they squeaked by Cal State Fullerton 62-58. Only Ella Dean was in double figures in that game. Beat Prairie View A&M a little closer than they would have liked, 65-50. But this was an impressive performance by Washington. I know it's a loss, but it feels similar to Michigan when they hung tight with South Carolina. A lot of good things can come of this for this Washington team that I think can be a spoiler in the Big Ten this year. They have a lot of experience back from last year, and this is a game that they're going to look back at. They're going to wish they would have won it, but it's certainly a game that's going to give them a lot of positives moving forward, that they can hang with the top 10 team in the country and probably should have won against the top 10 team in the country in LSU. So that's our game of the week. How about our player of the week? And we'll talk a little bit about these Battle for Atlantis games for the Hoosiers. My player of the week is Shea Chesky of Indiana. Again, part of my equation is what did you do in meaningful games? Well, as meaningful as it got this week was the Battle for Atlantis tournament for Indiana. And Shea Chesky put up 34 points in a semifinal win over number 18 Baylor. She was sensational in this game. It was everything Indiana could have hoped for when they pulled Shea Chesky out of the transfer portal and brought her to Bloomington. She was hitting the three-point shots, mid-range. She was making some moves, kind of some stutter steps, some Euro steps, some spins, getting to the basket, getting to the free throw line. Made a bunch of free throws in this game as well. And her energy on the floor is infectious. And I was so impressed with the way that Shea Chesky played in this game. Struggled in the other 2 games of the tournament, but man, just a standout performance in this one over Baylor. And a really nice win for the Hoosiers. Talk about up and down start for Washington. It's been an up and down start for Indiana. They've lost to Harvard and Butler, but bounced back with 3 straight wins over Stanford, Columbia, and Baylor. That could be 3 tournament teams right there in a row that Indiana beat. I think simply yesterday, you're seeing it across the screen now if you're watching us, UNC 69, Indiana 39. I think simply the Hoosiers just ran out of gas. They did have an injury to Sidney Parrish in this Baylor game in which they won 73-65. But I do think they just simply ran out of gas. And this was a team that was playing. I mean, Shea Chesky played 40 minutes in the North Carolina game. Chloe Moore McNeil played 37. And I know the team's not going to use that as an excuse, but this was a team that played 3 games in 3 days, lost one of its starters on game 2. Lexi Barchester is back, which is a big addition for Indiana off the bench, but she was playing on a minutes restriction. So Indiana was still kind of struggling to find that bench production. So I don't the basketball is one of those things where, and all sports are like this, but basketball specifically, when you start to fall down 10 to 15 points, there's a moment of the game where it's 10 to 15 point deficit. The other team's on a run. You either stop that run and you cut it back to 6, 7, 8 points and you're right back in the ball game, or it gets away from you. And then it just kind of avalanches. And sometimes there's nothing you could do about it. And Indiana got behind. North Carolina got red hot from 3. Indiana couldn't make anything from beyond the arc. They went over from 3 in the second half. And it just kind of turned into North Carolina putting on a show. And I don't necessarily view that as Indiana was I don't think Indiana's 30 points worse than North Carolina. I think this was Indiana not making any shots. North Carolina made about everything they could look at there at the end of the second quarter and into the third quarter. And really it just became an avalanche, snowballing on Indiana and a tired team, a shorthanded team, and they just couldn't get any traction of the game. I'm not all that worried about the Hoosiers. I took more out of losing to Butler and Harvard as, oh, okay, they got to figure something out. They did, and they played great against Stanford. They gritted a couple of games out against Columbia and Baylor earlier in this tournament. Very impressive performances. So for me, from an IU perspective, I'm not all that concerned about this. They're better than they were yesterday. There's no doubt about that. I think now they're going to have some opportunities here at home over the next month. They only play one road game away from home over the next, I think, 6 weeks. So they're going to have some home non-conference games to kind of figure this out. I don't know what the timetable is on the Sidney Parrish injury. Hopefully the Hoosiers can get her back because she is a vital piece in this thing. But I will give a shout out to Juliana Lamidola, had 11 rebounds starting in Sidney Parrish's spot. But again, Indiana 39 points. They shot really poor from the field. It just wasn't Indiana's day. And again, that happens in sports. It happens in basketball. Hoosiers shot 29%, 15% from 3, 4 of 26. Didn't make a 3 in the second half and scored just 13 points in the last 20 minutes. All those numbers are not great, but again, that I take away from the 3 games here in the Bahamas a lot more positives than I do negatives with the way they played against Columbia. They out-rebounded both Columbia and Baylor, which were both great rebounding teams in their own ways. I was very impressed with the toughness and the physicality Indiana gave in those first 2 games. I think they just simply didn't have the same amount of gas in the tank that North Carolina did. So when the Tar Heels started to get physical, Indiana couldn't quite give it back. So not worried about it. Hoosiers go 2-1 in the battle for Atlantis, but Shea Chesky, our player of the week, with 34 points. Some other notable performances we should shout out. How about Kendall Bostic? One of my favorite players in the Big Ten. I talked about it last week. 31 points against Oregon State. She continues to impress in her 5th year. I think she's absolutely right now probably a second-team All-Big Ten performer. Kayleen Smeichel continues to put up numbers for Maryland. Maryland not in any sort of concern of losing in their game against St. Francis, PA. Blew them out. 25 points for Smeichel. In a losing effort, Alexis Markowski put up a 26-point, 12-rebound double-double at Creighton. We're going to talk about Nebraska here in a second. Gracie Merkel back-to-back double-doubles in the WBCA showcase down in Orlando. 28 points in a win over Marshall. Penn State's off to a great start this year. Juju Watkins had 24 points in that loss to Notre Dame, and Savia Sellers 24 points in the loss to LSU. Some good performances out of the Big Ten players this week. Freshman of the week, Kaomi McMiller of Rutgers. Now, they did go 0-2 this week, but part of my criteria is, again, in important big games. They were good games. I mean, it was I should say good opponents. They struggled against Princeton as a team, but they were right there with Virginia Tech and Princeton, 2 good teams. And Kaomi McMiller put on a show. 25.5 points per game in those 2 contests in the losses for Rutgers. I know they went 0-2, but 24 points against Virginia Tech, 27 points against Princeton. She knocked down 7 of 19 threes over the week. She was the only person in that Princeton loss that scored over 8 points. She had more than half of her team's points in that loss. She is certainly somebody who might graduate from freshman of the week and just become player of the week at some point in this conference. Very impressive stuff from Kaomi McMiller. Some other performances from freshmen this week: Olivia Olson and Silas Swords, both having great weeks for Michigan. 22 points a game this week for Olson, 19.5 per game for Swords. Britt Prince, about 16.5 a game, had 20 in the loss at Creighton. And Lana McCarthy was the freshman of the week, according to the Big Ten. I believe she had 18 points in Purdue's win over UT Arlington. Let's double check that. Yep, 18 points and 5 rebounds for her. She was the Big Ten freshman of the week by the conference. All right, let's talk let's figure out where some of these teams are at. And again, I'm just going to go, my spreadsheet's alphabetical, so we're not picking any favorites here. It's simply alphabetical order. Illinois is up into the top 20, in the top 25 right now at number 19. They are 5-0. They kind of got their season started with some big wins. They beat Florida State and Marquette in the opening week of the season. A nice win over Oregon State on Friday. They outscored them 29-14 in the third quarter to jump out to a 25-point lead that they would cruise through the fourth quarter with. This is a big week for them, and we're going to talk about it in a minute. My game of the week here for week 4 is Illinois against Kentucky in the Music City Classic. But they are really cruising right now. They'll be tested this week, though. Indiana is 4-3. It's been an up-and-down start for the Hoosiers. They'll have about a week off here as they come back from the Bahamas. They're hosting Maine on Sunday. Iowa, 6-0, and now ranked in the top 25. A nice win for the Hawkeyes this week in the Sanford Pentagon against Kansas, 71-58. Lucy Olson and Hannah Stolke both had 16 points. Stolke with a double-double, adding 10 rebounds, and a nice win for Iowa over previously unbeaten Kansas. They also crushed Washington State on Sunday. Fun note from this one, Jan Jansen was able to get Aaliyah Guyton into the game. Their freshman who tore ACL as a high schooler. This was her first minutes back, played 2.5 minutes. They weren't expecting to get her out there, Coach Jansen said, but they were happy they were able to get her something kind of to get over that hump of returning to a game for the first time. So that was good. Iowa struggled from 3 in this game. I don't really think there's much to put into it, but they were just 2 of 17 on their home floor from 3 against Washington State. They're in the Cancun Challenge this weekend against Rhode Island and BYU. Maryland's a top 10 team in the country now. They're 6-0. Mentioned they cruised past St. Francis, Pennsylvania, 107-35. Kayleen Smichael with 25, Allie Kubek with 20, and Mira McLean had a double-double with 10 and 10. They're in the Navy Classic this week against George Mason and Toledo. Maryland's plenty proven itself with wins over Duke and Syracuse already this season. Michigan is the first team out of the AP Top 25. They are 5-1 on the year. Wins this week over LIU 96-31 and Long Beach State 111-56. Both games they were led in scoring by Olivia Olson and Silas Swords. Back-to-back double-figure games for Yulia Grabovsky. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but she's been terrific for Michigan this week. Friday versus Belmont in the Fort Myers tip-off is one of our games to watch this week as well. They'll play somebody else to be determined on Saturday in that Fort Myers tip-off as well. So Michigan, who was tested and lost against South Carolina but looked impressive, has kind of been on cruise control since. We're going to see them tested this week at the Fort Myers tip-off. Michigan State's a team that we haven't quite seen tested yet. 6-0. They're receiving the second most votes of any non-ranked team of the AP poll. They crushed Detroit Mercy on Wednesday, 101-44. Julia Woodard scored 17 points off the bench. Grace Van Sluten is a stat sheet stuffer, 16.7 rebounds, 5 assists. Good performance from the Arizona State transfer, Jaden Simmons with 15. They are playing today, this afternoon, against Cal in the Acrisure Classic. And then Wednesday, they will take on Arizona or Vanderbilt, also in the Acrisure Classic. So we will see Michigan State tested against a power conference opponent for the first time this week, which will be good to see. We'll see how Michigan State performs. Again, they are undefeated, 6-0. Minnesota is undefeated. They are 7-0, cruising to wins over Eastern Illinois and Montana this week. Grace Grahalski double figures in both games. Tori McKinney double figures in both games. Annika Stewart continues to produce off the bench for Minnesota, and Amaya Battle and Sophie Hart were both good in the Montana game. They get Houston and Louisiana in the Big Easy Classic this weekend. But again, Minnesota, they've had some tests. SMU, Oregon State hasn't been all that challenging for Minnesota yet. Looking forward to seeing them get into a big game because they have played well so far this year. Nebraska was upset this past week on Friday night against Creighton, 80-74. The big news, though, was their Tuesday game against North Alabama. Unfortunately, Natalie Potts, the co-freshman of the year of the Big Ten last year, tore her ACL. She is out for the season. We wish her the best in her recovery as she comes back from that injury, hopefully next season for Nebraska. But the key now, and they lost to Creighton by 6 on the road, a game that when we looked at the stats and the numbers last week previewing it, felt like it favored Nebraska heavily. My big question now with Natalie Potts out is where are you going to get that third scorer production? In this Creighton game, they got 26 and 12 out of Alexis Markowski and 20 points out of Britt Prince. You're going to have to get something from somebody else. In North Alabama, they did. It's a different level of competition. Rimdahl, the Florida transfer, had 13 points. Kellen Hake had 17. Jessica Petrie had 14. But nobody outside of Markowski and Prince was in double figures at Creighton on Friday. They're going to have to get that type of production out of somebody else. Doesn't have to be the same person every game, but somebody else has to step up as that third scorer for this Nebraska team now that Natalie Potts is out. And obviously, they deserve time to figure that out because Natalie Potts was injured just a week ago. So they will figure that out. I think they'll be a force to be reckoned with in the Big Ten. They take on Kansas City later today. Northwestern, tough loss to a good Harvard team. Northwestern sits at 1-3. They've got Loyola Chicago later today and Cornell later this week. Ohio State's up to number 11 in the AP poll, a dominant win over in-state rival Ohio, 106-42, and then against Bowling Green, 96-53. Chance Gray had 38 points over the 2 games this week. Taylor Theory was good, double-double against Ohio, 17 points against Bowling Green. Ava Watson came off the bench against Bowling Green, scored 20. Jelani Cambridge averaged 18 a game this week. So good performances from Ohio State. Again, they are not being tested much here early in their season. They were tested against Belmont, squeaked that one out. They're going to be tested later on in the non-con and, of course, into conference play. But they take on Old Dominion and Utah State this week in the Daytona Beach Classic. Oregon up to number 21, but again, they lost yesterday in the Hawaii North Shore Showcase to Georgia Tech, 74-58. Deja Kelly had 10 points, but she was the only one in double figures. 10 players scored, but a bunch of kind of 1 or 2 bucket performances. Oregon was just 2 of 13 from 3. And this was right after Wednesday at home when they squeaked one out against Auburn, 70-68. So Oregon had been showing some signs. They've played a ton of games early in the season in quick succession, so maybe a little bit of tired legs there for Oregon. They're going to play again today against South Dakota State in that Hawaii North Shore Showcase, but a bit of a surprise there to see them lose by 16 to Georgia Tech, the first loss of the season for Oregon. Penn State, one of the surprise teams, they are into the last 4 in. I believe they might be the last team in Charlie Cream's bracketology this morning. Penn State 7-0, wins over Marshall and Georgia this week in the WBCA Showcase. Both of them by double figures. Gracie Merkel, double-double in both games, had 28 and 11 against Marshall. Allie Campbell, double figures in both games. And Mariah Murray, after a slow game against Marshall, shot out of the gates against Georgia, 24 points on 7 made threes as she continues to light it up for the Penn State Lady Lions. They have Drexel and St. John's at home coming up in the next week. Purdue is 4-1, played just 1 game this week, 73-55 over UT Arlington. They're also in the Fort Myers tip-off. They're going to get Middle Tennessee on Thursday, and then Saturday, a huge test against the defending national champion, number 4 ranked South Carolina Gamecocks. Rutgers, we touched on, lost a couple of times this week. They get Marquette and Georgia Southern this coming week. They're 4-2 on the season. Number 1, UCLA, we mentioned they're in the Rainbow Wahine Showdown this week against UT Martin, Fresno State, and Hawaii, 5-0 for the Bruins. USC 4-1. They're the Acrisure Holiday Invitational. We touched on that already. Washington, a great valiant effort against LSU. They're 6-2 now on the season. They get Southern on Wednesday in the Pink Flamingo Championship. Wisconsin is they won a couple of games in close fashion this week over UIC and Omaha, won by 4 against the Flames and just 2 against Omaha. Sarah Williams had 20 points and 14 rebounds in both games. Natalie Leisinger was good in both games. She hit the last 4 points all from the free throw line to get the win over Omaha. They're in the Cancun Challenge this week against San Diego State, Providence, and VCU. So that's kind of a pulse check on where everybody is in the Big Ten right now. Again, undefeated teams are still out there, and I think they will continue. We're not far away. Next week on Tuesday, we'll be talking about previewing Big Ten conference games. Remember, everybody gets a conference game in that early stage of December before we fully jump into conference play at the end of the month. But excited that next Tuesday we'll be previewing some Big Ten games here on this podcast. Game to watch this week. I mentioned it when we were running through there. It is number 14 Kentucky against number 19 Illinois at the Music City Classic. This is, I believe it's on like Baller Hoops or something. So on a subscription watch website for tomorrow when they play this game. But what an awesome test this will be for Illinois against Kenny Brooks and this new look Kentucky team. Georgia Amore, of course, came over from Virginia Tech with her coach. A new revamped Kentucky squad. Good test for the Wildcats as well. That's going to be a fun one. Michigan State against Cal today. Michigan State tested against either Vandy or Arizona tomorrow. So it'll be good to see the Spartans get tested. And Michigan, a couple of games in the Fort Myers tip-off starts on Friday against Belmont. That will be a good test for the Wolverines as well. So those are our games of the week. Again, a reminder that you can check us out in video form on the Back Home Network YouTube channel each and every week, Tuesdays at noon live, or you can go back and watch any episode in video form. You can also check us out on our podcast feed on either the Apple or Spotify podcast. I kind of look like an evil villain today, so maybe the podcast form is better for this episode. I just wanted the Bahamas background to be there. I didn't want to be sitting in a hotel room with curtains up. I know that would have made my face look better, but the background wouldn't have been as cool. So we've got another few days out here. Going to be broadcasting some of the men's games. Excited for that. But been a great week of women's hoops, and it will continue to be a little bit lighter on the marquee matchups this week. But next week, we'll be previewing Big Ten on Big Ten action, which is going to be awesome. Can't wait for that. It's going to be an awesome year in the Big Ten Conference. Thanks so much for joining us. I know it's been an abbreviated, not as in-depth episode. It's been a busy week here in the Bahamas. Next week, we'll get back home. We'll settle in. We'll rewatch some games. We'll have a full episode, hopefully with some guests for you. Next Tuesday, again at noon on the Back Home Network YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us. Subscribe, give us a download, a rating. Let us know how we're doing. We appreciate that kind of stuff. And follow us on social media as well at Dribble Drive WBB. It's been great week in the Bahamas. Hopefully it continues. Thanks for joining us live or listening in podcast form if that's how you took our content in as well. It's really starting to ramp up into a great year. We got the number one team in the country in the Big Ten, the UCLA Bruins. More to talk about as the season goes on. Enjoy your Thanksgiving week. Happy holidays. We'll talk to you guys next year.